Hi friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 14 of our read along together of Emma by Jane Austen. Today we have just 2 chapters, and so it's a kind of relaxed day. I'm going to start by having some Darjeeling tea. It's a loose leaf tea, and I don't know if I've ever actually read you the description of this one. I read it over while I was waiting for the tea to steep, and I just thought it was kind of amusing. So this is a loose leaf tea that I picked up at Shakespeare's Corner Tea Shop. Get a lot of tea there. And this was, their description was, distinct floral aroma. This tea is selected from the highest gardens in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. Only then does the tea have the subtle muscatel flavor. Well, of course I had to ask, what's muscatel? So I looked online because I've heard the word before and actually didn't know what it meant. It says that muscatel is a type of wine made from muscat grapes. The term is now normally used in the United States to refer to a fortified wine from these grapes rather than just any wine made from these grapes. So let's try. It does have a really nice flavor or aroma to it. I noticed it actually when I was first pouring the dry tea leaves into my pot right before I poured the water on it, but it did have like almost a sweetness to it, but not sweet like sugar. I mean, I see what they're saying about it being floral. I don't know that I would say it tastes like wine, grapes, but it is very good. So just a classic Darjeeling. Hello, good to see you all. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. By the way, thank you for those of you who said a little bit about major prognostication about what you think is going to happen in our story. Clearly, I want a happy ending. I'm not saying what's going to happen. But yeah, you guys are some pretty good guessers. But yeah, if anyone else has any thoughts on what might happen, I would love to see your thoughts now, and then we'll compare in a couple of weeks when we get to the end to see how close we were to the mark. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what happened in yesterday's chapters. We did read 3 chapters yesterday, chapters 32 through 32 of the book. And in chapter 30, the big thing was that the dance that they were planning at the Crown was going to be postponed or canceled because Mr. Frank Churchill had been called back home to Enscombe by his aunt, who was claiming to be ill. She's probably not really that ill, but she misses him, and so she wants him back. And so because he has to go, he takes his leave of all the denizens of Highbury. He visits of course he says goodbye to his father and his new mother-in-law, or sorry, now I'm doing the old terminology, his stepmother, Mrs. Weston. He says goodbye to the Bateses and Jane Fairfax on his way to go visit Hartfield, where he says goodbye to the Woodhouses. And it seems for a moment as if he might declare his feelings to Emma, and she's concerned. She doesn't really want him to do that. And so then the moment goes on hold and he leaves. And she reflects as he's gone that perhaps she might actually love him because she feels a listlessness, a weariness, she misses him quite a bit, but she's not sure if she can really be in love. So in the next chapter, she analyzes her feelings for Frank Churchill a bit more, and she decides clearly he is in love. Obviously, if he's in love with Emma, well, yeah. And so, but she, even though she has feelings for him, she doesn't quite see it as being really as in love as he is. Is she in love? Is she just a little bit in like? I mean, what is it? And so she's kind of trying to think of her feelings, and I'm trying to remember if it was in this chapter or the next chapter, but at some point in there's a bit about her saying she looks forward to the day when they can be good friends, that's what she wants from him. That in the scenarios where she is imagining him declaring his love for her and asking her to marry him perhaps, it usually ends with how can she politely decline it, and how can they just stay friends. And so she realized that for her at least, or at least in her awareness as it is now, who knows, maybe it'll change later on, she does not see herself marrying Frank Churchill, that she does see herself staying single, and that she just would like to reach the day when they can be friends. But she does have feelings for him. She feels quite fond for him. And so it's an interesting bit. We also, there is, in the second chapter that we read yesterday, there was a section about how Mr. Elton's bride is going to be coming back to town soon, that Mr. Elton is planning his wedding day, that the date has been set, and that Harriet is quite perturbed about it because she still does have feelings for Mr. Elton. And then finally, the last chapter we read, we meet Mrs. Elton. And remember, this is somebody that Mr. Elton had met after he left Highbury, after he was rejected by Emma, and he was so insulted by the idea of having like her think that he would marry Harriet Smith. And so he met this woman who he was able to woo quite successfully within a few weeks. The two of them agreed to be married, and she has 10,000 pounds. Yay. And so this woman is somebody whom Harriet finds to be quite lovely, and wow, she's very elegant, and wow, no wonder he chose her. She's so much better than me, kind of thing, you know. But Emma is not really impressed by Mrs. Elton. She finds her to be a bit vulgar. She finds her to be a bit pretentious. And in fact, we're treated to a long scene of the new Mrs. Elton talking about how, oh, Hartfield is quite like her own brother-in-law's grounds at Maple Grove. Maple Grove is like, ooh, her ideal place, I guess. And just, you know, just it's so nice, and they are so lucky to live at Hartfield because it's similar to Maple Grove, her own, you know, brother-in-law's estate. And so she makes quite frequent reference to her family, and she sort of says, oh, someday if you decide to go to Bath, maybe my friends will sponsor you and help you so you can perhaps find a husband. You don't see many people where you are, I'm sure, poor Miss Woodhouse. And so she is somebody who is maybe trying to be nice, but doing it in a not very polite way. Either way, Emma is not charmed at all. She's quite bothered by Mrs. Elton, and she is also, you know, she acknowledges that it's uncomfortable for Mr. Elton being at you know, having to be in a social situation with, or especially the first time when they all met each other, was a social situation with his new wife, Emma, the woman who he had asked to marry, who did not want him. And then also Harriet Smith, the woman whom Emma had thought he should be with, but he thought was below him. And so an awkward situation, but not made better by the crassness of the new Mrs. Elton. And so the chapter ended, I thought, delightfully with the Eltons leaving. And oh, also I forgot to mention too, there was a little bit where Mrs. Elton talked about how Mr. Knightley had encountered them, and she had been told by her husband, Mr. Elton, that Knightley was his good friend. And so she refers to him as Knightley, as if they're really close. And just Emma is horrified. I mean, she knows that Mr. Knightley doesn't really have a lot of respect for Mr. Elton. And the idea that Mr. Elton, and by extension Mrs. Elton, would call him Knightley as if they were close acquaintances, like, oh, how dare she? And so Emma's just upset all over about Mrs. Elton and just her lack of manners and her pretensions. And the chapter ended with her mind returning to Mrs. Elton's offenses, and long, very long did they occupy her. Oh, it's a great way of saying it. So let's go ahead and enjoy 2 chapters today. We can perhaps learn a little bit more about Mrs. Elton. Ooh, terrible, terrible woman. All right, so let's see. Today we're going to read chapters 33 and 34 of Emma, or if you're going by the other pagination in volume 2, we're reading chapters 15 and 16. So let's begin with chapter 33 of Emma by Jane Austen. Emma was not required by any subsequent discovery to retract her ill opinion of Mrs. Elton. Her observation had been pretty correct. Such as Mrs. Elton appeared to her on this second interview, such she appeared whenever they met again. Self-important, presuming, familiar, ignorant, and ill-bred. She had a little beauty and a little accomplishment, but so little judgment that she thought herself coming with superior knowledge of the world to enliven and improve a country neighborhood, and conceived Miss Hawkins to have held such a place in society as Mrs. Elton's consequence only could surpass. There was no reason to suppose Mr. Elton thought at all differently from his wife. He seemed not merely happy with her, but proud. He had the air of congratulating himself on having brought such a woman to Highbury as not even Miss Woodhouse could equal, and the greater part of her new acquaintance, disposed to commend, or not in the habit of judging, followed the lead of Miss Bates's goodwill, or taking it for granted that the bride must be as clever and as agreeable as she professed herself, were very well satisfied, so that Mrs. Elton's praise passed from one mouth to another as it ought to do, unimpeded by Miss Woodhouse, who readily continued her first contribution, and talked with a good grace of her being very pleasant and very elegantly dressed. In one respect, Mrs. Elton grew even worse than she had appeared at first. Her feelings altered towards Emma. Offended, probably, by the little encouragement which her proposals of intimacy met with, she drew back in her turn and gradually became much more cold and distant. And though the effect was agreeable, the ill will which produced it was necessarily increasing Emma's dislike. Her manners, too, and Mr. Elton's, were unpleasant towards Harriet. They were sneering and negligent. Emma hoped it must rapidly work Harriet's cure, but the sensations which could prompt such behavior sunk them both very much. It was not to be doubted that poor Harriet's attachment had been an offering to conjugal unreserve, and her own share in the story, under a coloring the least favorable to her and the most soothing to him, had in all likelihood been given also. She was, of course, the object of their joint dislike. When they had nothing else to say, it must be always easy to begin abusing Miss Woodhouse, and the enmity which they dared not show in open disrespect to her found a broader vent in contemptuous treatment of Harriet. Mrs. Elton took a great fancy to Jane Fairfax, and from the first, not merely when a state of warfare with one young lady might be supposed to recommend the other, but from the very first, and she was not satisfied with expressing a natural and reasonable admiration, but without solicitation or plea or privilege, she must be wanting to assist and befriend her. Before Emma had forfeited her confidence, and about the third time of their meeting, she heard all Mrs. Elton's knight-errantry on the subject. "Jane Fairfax is absolutely charming, Miss Woodhouse. I quite rave about Jane Fairfax. A sweet, interesting creature, so mild and ladylike, but with such talents. I assure you I think she has very extraordinary talents. I do not scruple to say that she plays extremely well. I know enough of music to speak decidedly on that point. Oh, she is absolutely charming. You will laugh at my warmth, but upon my word I talk of nothing but Jane Fairfax, and her situation is so calculated to affect one. Miss Woodhouse, we must exert ourselves and endeavor to do something for her. We must bring her forward. Such talents as hers must not be suffered to remain unknown. I dare say you have heard those charming lines of the poet, 'Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its fragrance on the desert air.' We must not allow them to be verified in sweet Jane Fairfax." "I cannot think there is any danger in it," was Emma's calm answer, "and when you are better acquainted with Miss Fairfax's situation, and understand what her home has been, with Colonel and Mrs. Campbell, I have no idea that you will suppose her talents can be unknown." "Oh, but dear Miss Woodhouse, she is now in such retirement, such obscurity, so thrown away. Whatever advantages she may have enjoyed with the Campbells are so palpably at an end, and I think she feels it. I am sure she does. She is very timid and silent. One can see that she feels the want of encouragement. I like her the better for it. I must confess it is a recommendation to me. I am a great advocate for timidity, and I am sure one does not often meet with it. But in those who are at all inferior, it is extremely prepossessing. Oh, I assure you, Jane Fairfax is a very delightful character, and interests me more than I can express." "You appear to feel a great deal, but I am not aware how you or any of Miss Fairfax's acquaintances here, any of those who have known her longer than yourself, can show her any other attention than—" "My dear Miss Woodhouse, a vast deal may be done by those who dare to act. You and I need not be afraid. If we set the example, many will follow it as far as they can, though all have not our situations. We have carriages to fetch and convey her home, and we live in a style which could not make the addition of Jane Fairfax at any time the least inconvenient. I should be extremely displeased if Wright were to send us up such a dinner as could make me regret having asked more than Jane Fairfax to partake of it. I have no idea of that sort of thing. It is not likely that I should, considering what I have been used to. My greatest danger, perhaps, in housekeeping may be quite the other way, in doing too much and being too careless of expense. Maple Grove will probably be my model more than it ought to be, for we do not at all affect to equal my brother, Mr. Suckling, in income. However, my resolution is taking as to noticing Jane Fairfax. I shall certainly have her very often at my house, shall introduce her wherever I can, shall have musical parties to draw out her talents, and shall be constantly on the watch for an eligible situation. My acquaintance is so very extensive that I have little doubt of hearing of something to suit her shortly. I shall introduce her, of course, very particularly to my brother and sister when they come to us. I am sure they will like her extremely, and when she gets a little acquainted with them, her fears will completely wear off, for there really is nothing in the manners of either but what is highly conciliating. I shall have her very often indeed while they are with me, and I dare say we shall sometimes find a seat for her in the barouche landau in some of our exploring parties. Poor Jane Fairfax, thought Emma. You have not deserved this. You may have done wrong with regard to Mr. Dickson, but this is a punishment beyond what you can have merited. The kindness and protection of Mrs. Elton. Jane Fairfax and Jane Fairfax. Heavens! Let me not suppose that she dares go about Emma Woodhousing me. But upon my honor, there seem no limits to the licentiousness of that woman's tongue. Emma had not to listen to such paradings again, to any so exclusively addressed to herself, so disgustingly decorated with a "dear Miss Woodhouse." The change on Mrs. Elton's side soon afterwards appeared, and she was left in peace, neither forced to be the very particular friend of Mrs. Elton, nor, under Mrs. Elton's guidance, the very active patroness of Jane Fairfax, and only sharing with others in a general way, in knowing what was felt, what was meditated, what was done. She looked on with some amusement. Miss Bates's gratitude for Mrs. Elton's attentions to Jane was in the first style of guileless simplicity and warmth. She was quite one of her worthies, the most amiable, affable, delightful woman, just as accomplished and condescending as Mrs. Elton meant to be considered. Emma's only surprise was that Jane Fairfax should accept those attentions and tolerate Mrs. Elton as she seemed to do. She heard of her walking with the Eltons, sitting with the Eltons, spending a day with the Eltons. This was astonishing. She could not have believed it possible that the taste or the pride of Miss Fairfax could endure such society and friendship as the vicarage had to offer. She is a riddle, quite a riddle, said she. To choose to remain here month after month, under privations of every sort, and now to choose the mortification of Mrs. Elton's notice and the penury of her conversation, rather than return to the superior companions who have always loved her with such real, generous affection. Jane had come to Highbury professedly for 3 months. The Campbells were gone to Ireland for 3 months. But now the Campbells had promised their daughter to stay at least till midsummer, and fresh invitations had arrived for her to join them there. According to Miss Bates, it all came from her, Mrs. Dickson had written most pressingly. Would Jane but go, means were to be found, servants sent, friends contrived, no traveling difficulty allowed to exist. But still, she had declined it. She must have some motive, more powerful than appears, for refusing this invitation, was Emma's conclusion. She must be under some sort of penance, inflicted either by the Campbells or herself. There is great fear, great caution, great resolution somewhere. She is not to be with the Dicksons. The decree is issued by somebody. But why must she consent to be with the Eltons? Here is quite a separate puzzle. Upon her speaking her wonder aloud on that part of the subject, before the few who knew her opinion of Mrs. Elton, Mrs. Weston ventured this apology for Jane. We cannot suppose that she has any great enjoyment at the vicarage, my dear Emma, but it is better than being always at home. Her aunt is a good creature, but as a constant companion must be very tiresome. We must consider that we must consider what Miss Fairfax quits before we condemn her taste for what she goes to. You are right, Mrs. Weston, said Mr. Knightley warmly. Miss Fairfax is as capable as any of us of forming a just opinion of Mrs. Elton. Could she have chosen with whom to associate, she would not have chosen her. But, with a reproachful smile at Emma, She receives attentions from Mrs. Elton, which nobody else pays her. Emma felt that Mrs. Weston was giving her a momentary glance, and she was herself struck by his warmth. With a faint blush, she presently replied, "Such attentions as Mrs. Elton's, I should have imagined, would rather disgust than gratify Miss Fairfax. Mrs. Elton's invitations I should have imagined anything but inviting." "I should not wonder," said Mrs. Weston, "if Miss Fairfax were to have been drawn on beyond her own inclination by her aunt's eagerness in accepting Mrs. Elton's civilities for her. Poor Miss Bates may very likely have committed her niece and hurried her into a greater appearance of intimacy than her own good sense would have dictated, in spite of the very natural wish of a little change." Both felt rather anxious to hear him speak again, and after a few minutes' silence, he did. "Another thing must be taken into consideration, too. Mrs. Elton does not talk to Miss Fairfax as she speaks of her. We all know the difference between the pronouns he or she and thou, the plainest spoken amongst us. We all feel the influence of a something beyond common civility in our personal intercourse with each other, a something more early implanted. We cannot give anybody the disagreeable hints that we may have been very full of the hour before. We feel things differently, and besides the operation of this, as a general principle, you may be sure that Miss Fairfax awes Mrs. Elton by her superiority both of mind and manner, and that face to face Mrs. Elton treats her with all the respect which she has a claim to. Such a woman as Jane Fairfax probably never fell in Mrs. Elton's way before, and no degree of vanity can prevent her acknowledging her own comparative littleness in action, if not in consciousness." "I know how highly you think of Jane Fairfax," said Emma. Little Henry was in her thoughts, and a mixture of alarm and delicacy made her irresolute what else to say. "Yes," he replied, "anybody may know how highly I think of her." "And yet," said Emma, beginning hastily and with an arch look, but soon stopping. It was better, however, to know the worst at once. She hurried on. "And yet, perhaps you may hardly be aware yourself how highly it is. The extent of your admiration may take you by surprise some day or other." Mr. Knightley was hard at work upon the lower buttons of his thick leather gaiters, and either the exertion of getting them together or some other cause brought the color into his face as he answered, "Oh, are you there? But you are miserably behindhand. Mr. Cole gave me a hint of it 6 weeks ago." He stopped. Emma felt her foot pressed by Mrs. Weston and did not herself know what to think. In a moment he went on. "There will never be, however, I can assure you. Miss Fairfax, I dare say, would not have me if I were to ask her, and I am very sure I shall never ask her." Emma returned her friend's pressure with interest, and was pleased enough to exclaim, "You are not vain, Mr. Knightley. I will say that for you." He seemed hardly to hear her. He was thoughtful, and in a manner which showed him not pleased, soon afterward said, "So you have been settling that I should marry Jane Fairfax?" "No, indeed I have not. You have scolded me too much for matchmaking for me to presume to take such a liberty with you. What I said just now meant nothing. One says those sorts of things, of course, without any idea of a serious meaning. Oh, no, upon my word, I have not the smallest wish for your marrying Jane Fairfax, or Jane anybody. You would not come in and sit with us in this comfortable way if you were married." Mr. Knightley was thoughtful again. The result of his reverie was, "No, Emma, I do not think the extent of my admiration for her will ever take me by surprise. I never had a thought of her in that way, I assure you." And soon afterwards, "Jane Fairfax is a very charming young woman, but not even Jane Fairfax is perfect. She has a fault. She has not the open temper which a man would wish for in a wife." Emma could not but rejoice to hear that she had a fault. "Well," said she, "and you soon silenced Mr. Cole, I suppose?" "Yes, very soon. He gave me a quiet hint. I told him he was mistaken. He asked my pardon and said no more. Cole does not want to be wiser or wittier than his neighbors." In that respect, how unlike dear Mrs. Elton, who wants to be the wiser and wittier than all the world. I wonder how she speaks of the Coles, what she calls them. How can she find any appellation for them deep enough in familiar vulgarity? She calls you Knightley. What can she do for Mr. Cole? And so I am not to be surprised that Jane Fairfax accepts her civilities and consents to be with her. Mrs. Weston, your argument weighs most with me. I can much more readily enter into the temptation of getting away from Miss Bates than I can believe in the triumph of Miss Fairfax's mind over Mrs. Elton. I have no faith in Mrs. Elton's acknowledging herself the inferior in thought, word, or deed, or in her being under any restraint beyond her own scanty rule of good breeding. I cannot imagine that she will not be continually insulting her visitor with praise, encouragement, and offers of service, that she will not be continually detailing her magnificent intentions from the procuring her a permanent situation to the including her in those delightful exploring parties which are to take place in the barouche landau. Jane Fairfax has feeling, said Mr. Knightley. I do not accuse her of want of feeling. Her sensibilities, I suspect, are strong, and her temper excellent in its power of forbearance, patience, self-control, but it wants openness. She is reserved, more reserved, I think, than she used to be, and I love an open temper. No, till Cole alluded to my supposed attachment, it had never entered my head. I saw Jane Fairfax and conversed with her, with admiration and pleasure always, but with no thought beyond. Well, Mrs. Weston, said Emma triumphantly when he left them, what do you say now to Mr. Knightley's marrying Jane Fairfax? Why, really, dear Emma, I say that he is so very much occupied by the idea of not being in love with her that I should not wonder if it were to end in his being so at last. Do not beat me. And now chapter 34 of Emma, or chapter 16 of volume 2. Everybody in and about Highbury who had ever visited Mr. Elton was disposed to pay him attention on his marriage. Dinner parties and evening parties were made for him and his lady, and invitations flowed in so fast that she had soon the pleasure of apprehending they were never to have a disengaged day. I see how it is, said she. I see what a life I am to lead among you. Upon my word, we shall be absolutely dissipated. We really seem quite the fashion. If this is living in the country, it is nothing very formidable. From Monday next to Saturday, I assure you we have not a disengaged day. A woman with fewer resources than I have need not have been at a loss. No invitation came amiss to her. Her Bath habits made evening parties perfectly natural to her, and Maple Grove had given her a taste for dinners. She was a little shocked at the want of 2 drawing-rooms, at the poor attempt at rout cakes, and there being no ice in the Highbury card parties. Mrs. Bates, Mrs. Perry, Mrs. Goddard, and others were a good deal behindhand in knowledge of the world, but she would soon show them how everything ought to be arranged. In the course of the spring, she must return their civilities by one very superior party, in which her card tables should be set out with their separate candles and unbroken packs in the true style, and more waiters engaged for the evening than their own establishment could furnish, to carry round the refreshments at exactly the proper hour and in the proper order. Emma, in the meanwhile, could not be satisfied without a dinner at Hartfield for the Eltons. They must not do less than others, or she should be exposed to odious suspicions and imagined capable of pitiful resentment. A dinner there must be. After Emma had talked about it for 10 minutes, Mr. Woodhouse felt no unwillingness, and only made the usual stipulation of not sitting at the bottom of the table himself, with the usual regular difficulty of deciding who should do it for him. The persons to be invited required little thought. Besides the Eltons, it must be the Westons and Mr. Knightley. So far it was all of course, and it was hardly less inevitable that poor little Harriet must be asked to make the 8th. But this invitation was not given with equal satisfaction, and on many accounts Emma was particularly pleased by Harriet's begging to be allowed to decline it. She would rather not be in his company more than she could help. She was not quite able to see him and his charming, happy wife together without feeling uncomfortable. If Miss Woodhouse would not be displeased, she would rather stay at home. It was precisely what Emma would have wished, but had deemed it possible enough for wishing. She was delighted with the fortitude of her little friend. For fortitude she knew it was in her to give up being in company and stay at home, and she could now invite the very person whom she really wanted to make the 8th, Jane Fairfax. Since her last conversation with Mrs. Weston and Mr. Knightley, she was more conscience-stricken about Jane Fairfax than she had often been. Mr. Knightley's words dwelt with her. He had said that Jane Fairfax received attentions from Mrs. Elton, which nobody else paid her. "This is very true," said she, "at least as far as relates to me, which was all that he meant. And it is very shameful. Of the same age, and always knowing her. I ought to have been more her friend. She will never like me now. I have neglected her too long. But I will show her greater attention than I have done." Every invitation was successful. They were all disengaged and all happy. The preparatory interest in this dinner, however, was not yet over. A circumstance rather unlucky occurred. The two eldest little Knightleys were engaged to pay their grandpapa and aunt a visit of some weeks in the spring, and their papa now proposed bringing them and staying one whole day at Hartfield, which one day would be the very day of this party. His professional engagements did not allow of his being put off, but both father and daughter were disturbed by its happening so. Mr. Woodhouse considered 8 persons at dinner together as the utmost that his nerves could bear, and here would be a 9th. And Emma apprehended that it would be a 9th very much out of humor at not being able to come even to Hartfield for 48 hours without falling in with a dinner party. She comforted her father better than she could comfort herself by representing that though he certainly would make them 9, yet he always said so little that the increase of noise would be very immaterial. She thought it in reality a sad exchange for herself to have him with his grave looks and reluctant conversation opposed to her instead of his brother. The event was more favorable to Mr. Woodhouse than to Emma. John Knightley came, but Mr. Weston was unexpectedly summoned to town and must be absent on the very day. He might be able to join them in the evening, but certainly not to dinner. Mr. Woodhouse was quite at ease, and the seeing him so, with the arrival of the little boys and the philosophic composure of her brother on hearing his fate, removed the chief of even Emma's vexation. The day came, the party were punctually assembled, and Mr. John Knightley seemed early to devote himself to the business of being agreeable. Instead of drawing his brother off to a window while they waited for dinner, he was talking to Miss Fairfax. Mrs. Elton, as elegant as lace and pearls could make her, he looked at in silence, wanting only to observe enough for Isabella's information. But Miss Fairfax was an old acquaintance and a quiet girl, and he could talk to her. He had met her before breakfast as he was returning from a walk with his little boys when it had been just beginning to rain. It was natural to have some civil hopes on the subject, and he said, "I hope you did not venture far, Miss Fairfax, this morning, or I am sure you must have been wet. We scarcely got home in time. I hope you turned directly." "I went only to the post office," said she, "and reached home before the rain was much. It is my daily errand. I always fetch the letters when I am here. It saves trouble, and is a something to get me out. A walk before breakfast does me good." "Not a walk in the rain, I should imagine." "No, but it did not absolutely rain when I set out." Mr. John Knightley smiled and replied, "That is to say, you chose to have your walk, for you were not 6 yards from your own door when I had the pleasure of meeting you, and Henry and John had seen more drops than they could count long before. The post office has a great charm at one period of our lives. When you have lived to my age, you'll begin to think letters are never worth going through the rain for." There was a little blush, and then this answer: "I must not hope to be ever situated as you are in the midst of every dearest connection, and therefore I cannot expect that simply growing older should make me indifferent about letters." "Indifferent? Oh no, I never conceived you could become indifferent. Letters are no matter of indifference. They are generally a very positive curse." "You are speaking of letters of business. Mine are letters of friendship." "I have often thought them the worst of the two," replied he coolly. "Business, you know, may bring money, but friendship hardly ever does." "Ah, you are not serious now. I know Mr. John Knightley too well. I am very sure he understands the value of friendship as well as anybody. I can easily believe that letters are very little to you, much less than to me, but it is not your being 10 years older than myself which makes the difference. It is not age, but situation. You have everybody dearest to you always at hand. I, probably, never shall again, and therefore till I have outlived all my affections, a post office, I think, must always have power to draw me out in worse weather than today. When I talked of your being altered by time, by the progress of years, said John Knightley, I meant to imply the change of situation which time usually brings. I consider one as including the other. Time will generally lessen the interest of every attachment not within the daily circle, but that is not the change I had in view for you. As an old friend, you will allow me to hope, Miss Fairfax, that 10 years hence you may have as many concentrated objects as I have. It was kindly said, and very far from giving offense. A pleasant "thank you" seemed meant to laugh it off, but a blush, a quivering lip, a tear in the eye showed that it was felt beyond a laugh. Her attention was now claimed by Mr. Woodhouse, who being, according to his custom on such occasions, making the circle of his guests, and paying his particular compliments to the ladies, was ending with her, and with all his mildest urbanity said, I am very sorry to hear, Miss Fairfax, of your being out this morning in the rain. Young ladies should take care of themselves. Young ladies are delicate plants. They should take care of their health and their complexion. My dear, did you change your stockings? Yes, sir, I did indeed, and I am very much obliged by your kind solicitude about me. My dear Miss Fairfax, young ladies are very sure to be cared for. I hope your good grandmamma and aunt are well. They are some of my very old friends. I wish my health allowed me to be a better neighbor. You do us a great deal of honor today, I am sure. My daughter and I are both highly sensible of your goodness and have the greatest satisfaction in seeing you at Hartfield. The kind-hearted, polite old man might then sit down and feel that he had done his duty and made every fair lady welcome and easy. By this time, the walk in the rain had reached Mrs. Elton, and her remonstrances now opened upon Jane. My dear Jane, what is this I hear? Going to the post office in the rain? This must not be, I assure you. You sad girl, how could you do such a thing? It is a sign I was not there to take care of you. Jane very patiently assured her that she had not caught any cold. Oh, do not tell me. You really are a very sad girl and do not know how to take care of yourself. To the post office indeed. Mrs. Weston, did you ever hear the like? You and I must positively exert our authority. My advice, said Mrs. Weston kindly and persuasively, I certainly do feel tempted to give. Miss Fairfax, you must not run such risks. Liable as you have been to severe colds, indeed you ought to be particularly careful, especially at this time of year. The spring I always think requires more than common care. Better wait an hour or two, or even half a day for your letters, than run the risk of bringing on your cough again. Now, do not you feel that you had? Yes, I am sure you are much too reasonable. You look as if you would not do such a thing again. Oh, she shall not do such a thing again, eagerly rejoined Mrs. Elton. We will not allow her to do such a thing again. And nodding significantly, there must be some arrangement made. There must indeed. I shall speak to Mr. E., the man who fetches our letters every morning. One of our men, I forget his name, shall inquire for yours too and bring them to you. That will obviate all difficulties, you know. And from us, I really think, my dear Jane, you can have no scruple to accept such an accommodation. You are extremely kind, said Jane, but I cannot give up my early walk. I am advised to be out of doors as much as I can. I must walk somewhere, and the post office is an object. And upon my word, I have scarcely ever had a bad morning before. My dear Jane, say no more about it. The thing is determined. That is, laughing affectedly, as far as I can presume to determine anything without the concurrence of my lord and master. You know, Mrs. Weston, you and I must be cautious how we express ourselves. But I do flatter myself, my dear Jane, that my influence is not entirely worn out. If I meet with no insuperable difficulties, therefore, consider that point settled. Excuse me, said Jane earnestly. I cannot by any means consent to such an arrangement, so needlessly troublesome to your servant. If the errand were not a pleasure to me, it could be done, as it always is when I am not here, by my grandmamma's. Oh, my dear, but so much as Patty has to do, and it is a kindness to employ our men. Jane looked as if she did not mean to be conquered, but instead of answering, she began speaking again to Mr. John Knightley. "The post office is a wonderful establishment," said she. "The regularity and dispatch of it. If one thinks of all that it has to do, and all that it does so well, it is really astonishing." "It is certainly very well regulated." "So seldom that any negligence or blunder appears. So seldom that a letter, among the thousands that are constantly passing about the kingdom, is even carried wrong, and not 1 in a million, I suppose, actually lost. And when one considers the variety of hands, and of bad hands too, that are to be deciphered, it increases the wonder. The clerks grow expert from habit. They must begin with some quickness of sight and hand, and exercise improves them. If you want any further explanation," continued he, smiling, "they are paid for it. That is the key to a great deal of capacity. The public pays and must be served well." The varieties of handwriting were further talked of, and the usual observations made. "I have heard it asserted," said John Knightley, "that the same sort of handwriting often prevails in a family, and where the same master teaches, it is natural enough. But for that reason, I should imagine the likeness must be chiefly confined to the females, for boys have very little teaching after an early age, and scramble into any hand they can get. Isabella and Emma, I think, do write very much alike. I have not always known their writing apart." "Yes," said his brother hesitatingly, "there is a likeness. I know what you mean, but Emma's hand is the strongest." "Isabella and Emma both write beautifully," said Mr. Woodhouse, "and always did. And so does poor Mrs. Weston," with half a sigh and half a smile at her. "I never saw any gentleman's handwriting," Emma began, looking also at Mrs. Weston, but stopped on perceiving that Mrs. Weston was attending to someone else, and the pause gave her time to reflect. "Now, how am I going to introduce him? Am I unequal to speaking his name at once before all these people? Is it necessary for me to use any roundabout phrase? Your Yorkshire friend? Your correspondent in Yorkshire? That would be the way, I suppose, if I were very bad. No, I can pronounce his name without the smallest distress. I certainly get better and better. Now, for it." Mrs. Weston was disengaged, and Emma began again. "Mr. Frank Churchill writes one of the best gentleman's hands I ever saw." "I do not admire it," said Mr. Knightley. "It is too small, wants strength. It is like a woman's writing." This was not submitted to by either lady. They vindicated him against the base aspersion. No, it by no means wanted strength. It was not a large hand, but very clear and certainly strong. Had not Mrs. Weston any letter about her to produce? No, she had heard from him very lately, but having answered the letter had put it away. "If we were in the other room," said Emma, "if I had my writing desk, I am sure I could produce a specimen. I have a note of his. Do not you remember, Mrs. Weston, employing him to write for you one day?" "He chose to say he was employed." Well, I have that note and can show it after dinner to convince Mr. Knightley." "Oh, when a gallant young man like Mr. Frank Churchill," said Mr. Knightley dryly, "writes to a fair lady like Miss Woodhouse, he will, of course, put forth his best effort." Dinner was on table. Mrs. Elton, before she could be spoken to, was ready, and before Mr. Woodhouse had reached her with his request to be allowed to hand her into the dining parlor, was saying, "Must I go first? I really am ashamed of always leading the way." Jane's solicitude about fetching her own letters had not escaped Emma. She had heard and seen it all, and felt some curiosity to know whether the wet walk of this morning had produced any. She suspected that it had, that it would not have been so resolutely encountered, but in full expectation of hearing from some one very dear, and that it had not been in vain. She thought there was an air of greater happiness than usual, a glow both of complexion and spirits. She could have made an inquiry or two as to the expedition and the expense of the Irish mails. It was at her tongue's end, but she abstained. She was quite determined not to utter a word that should hurt Jane Fairfax's feelings, and they followed the other ladies out of the room, arm in arm, with an appearance of goodwill highly becoming to the beauty and grace of each. that concludes today's reading. Tomorrow we will hear more about this party at the Woodhouse home at Hartfield, and we'll see what happens, if there's any more fireworks with Mrs. Elton or something about the males, if we find anything else. We'll see tomorrow in our reading from Emma by Jane Austen. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Catch you tomorrow. Bye.